This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Listening to this podcast instead of doom scrolling? Smart move. Another smart move? Getting help from one of State Farm's 19,000 local agents when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the Personal Price Plan. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Mornings have a rhythm. You can hear it, feel it. And at Quaker, we fuel it. With 100% whole grain oats and a good source of fiber in every bowl, helping you turn that rhythm into your soundtrack for a great day. Fuel to start whatever's next. Quaker, official sponsor of FIFA World Cup 26.
Let's go! Let's go!
Chronic migraine, 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more, can make me feel like a spectator in my own life.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine. It's not for those with 14 or fewer headache days a month. It's the #1 prescribed branded chronic migraine preventive treatment.
Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Why wait? Ask your doctor, visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com, or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get Unbound.
Hi, welcome back to Unbound, Season 4, Invisible Daughter. I'm Beth Curry. If you're new here, seasons of my show are based on books I've written and published. My books have been described as self-help rooted in personal experience. Once an article had been written about me saying that, it kind of stuck with me and I realized something. I wanted to make my content more accessible to people because I've been told over and over and over again how helpful it is and how relatable it is and all that. And I know that not everyone can afford books or audiobooks. And I realized I could make a free podcast. I actually didn't realize it was suggested to me by somebody. And I thought about it and I decided that this was the best way to do it because then I can share the books and the content and have the conversations around it all. And that's kind of how Unbound came to be last year. So season 1 was all these beautiful things and it was tackling kind of my experience with being a care partner with my mom and her dementia. And it was like stories from her past and how she kind of remembers them now in bits and pieces. And she had some friends who contributed for some of the chapters, their stories. And then I would take their stories and I'd kind of get her insight and what she remembered about them. Season 2 was called The Weight of Truth. And in that season, I shared my story of losing over 200 pounds and how I got to that point actually of being almost 400 pounds and how I changed my lifestyle and what I did. Over the last 10, 12, 14 years that I've actually been on this journey of keeping the weight off, trying my best to keep the weight off, but also losing it. Many people said, are you going to ever write a book about this and kind of share your secrets? Didn't have any secrets, but I shared kind of everything in season 2. And season 3, which just wrapped a couple of months ago, The Other Side of Quiet. In that one, I shared my story of adolescent trauma and abuse and loss and finally finding peace after over 3 decades of kind of holding it all in and not telling, my story. And now we're at season 4, which is going to be a little bit different because although, a book was written and a cover was done, the book never went to publication because I have this podcast now and I didn't really see a point in making that investment time, whatever. Prior seasons for each episode, I would read a chapter and then discuss it. But now I'm kind of blending podcast episode with book chapter. So the format will probably be a little bit more conversational. If you're joining me for this season, I want you to take a deep breath. Okay, drop your shoulders away from your ears. I literally just did that myself. Unclench your jaw, and if you're currently running a mental inventory of your mom's prescription refill schedule, or maybe your partner's dry cleaning, or your best friend's relationship status, whether or not your neighbor's cat looked depressed this morning, I don't know. Give yourself permission to put the clipboard down for the next little while here, okay? You're officially off the clock. This season is called Invisible Daughter, and I'm spending our time here together kind of pulling back the curtain on a very quiet and fascinating and very polite and completely exhausting phenomenon, okay? I'll be talking about this unspoken assignment that's handed to daughters everywhere. The expectation to be the family's emotional thermostat and the default crisis manager and the unpaid mediator and the natural born caregiver, right? I do want to be clear. This book is for all caregivers, all everything, even though I probably narrowed my audience down quite a bit by calling it Invisible Daughter. There are plenty of stories from real people here, including men, sons, brothers, husbands, you name it. But I'm digging into why it's typically the women in the family who become the helpers and the caregivers. Okay. So today for our premiere episode, I'm going to go back to the absolute beginning. I'm going to look at the foundational architecture of this trap. I'm calling this one the Good Girls Training Ground because the truth is, nobody wakes up at 35 or 45 just drowning under the weight of everyone else's emotional baggage by accident, right? You don't just stumble into becoming a professional full-time emotional processing center for a rotating cast of family members and friends and coworkers. I believe we are trained for it from a very, very young age. And ironically enough, that training program doesn't look like boot camp at all. It doesn't look like punishment either. It's just, it comes in the form of high praise that's delivered with immense love. And it's disguised as like magnificent opportunity, right? And it starts innocently enough, a little girl who's eager to please and a parent who's genuinely grateful for a hand and maybe a warm moment of connection over shared work. But somewhere in those early tender exchanges, something kind of shifts, right? Helping stops being an action you choose to do, and it transforms into like this identity you're kind of required to be. So I'm going to start by talking about my own entry into this corporate ladder of emotional labor. I was about 4, maybe 3 or 4, when I officially announced my grand career plan to my family. I wasn't going to be an astronaut. I wasn't going to be a princess. I announced that I was going to be a nurse in the labor and delivery ward, specifically helping babies come into the world. Then, by the ripe old age of 5, I'd already kind of reviewed my corporate strategy and revised the plan. I would instead work in the hospital nursery, rocking babies all the livelong day. Now, look, most 5-year-olds have career plans that last about as long as a sugar rush, right? They want to be dinosaurs or garbage trucks or firemen, but I was terrifyingly specific, and my toys reflected this career trajectory as well. Like, my dolls weren't just toys, they were literal practice. They were an entry-level internship, if you will. I didn't dress them up or throw them in a toy box. I ran like this high-stakes medical and psychological operation in my bedroom. I fed them on a strict schedule. Ridiculous. I changed them, I sang to them, and I just kind of created this incredibly elaborate high drama scenarios, where they desperately needed this profound emotional comfort, and I was the single solitary soul who could provide it. If you had walked into my room back then, you wouldn't have seen a child playing. You would have seen a tiny unauthorized daycare CEO, My mom would frequently find me sitting on the floor surrounded by probably a dozen dolls, and each one was carefully arranged in a precise strategic grid as if I was running some sort of a highly regulated medical facility. Okay. When relatives came over, the reviews were glowing. They would look at me huddled over my plastic patients and say, "Oh, look at her. She's such a little mother," or "My goodness, she's just so nurturing for her age." And you know what? I glowed under that praise for sure. I drank it in like a fine damn wine. I was profoundly proud of my calling to care. While other kids were outside eating dirt or shoving Legos up their noses, I was getting high on the intoxicating drug of adult validation. I was the mature one. I was the good one. What I didn't know then, what my 5-year-old brain couldn't possibly articulate was that I wasn't just playing. I was an empath in training. Oh, dear God. I was walking through, my childhood home with my emotional skin turned completely inside out, absorbing the ambient emotions of the house like some high-grade kitchen sponge or something, right? I was picking up on my mother's unspoken sadness and my father's stress and, just the baseline anxiety of the whole family dynamic and the microscopic tensions that live in, the spaces between all of us, right? I felt absolutely everything, and a kid's brain can't process that amount of unmanaged emotional data without finding a circuit breaker. Okay, so the dolls, they were my circuit breaker. They became my outlet, my way of transforming an overwhelming, chaotic ocean of human emotion into this tidy, manageable ritual of care. And when I was tending to these dolls, I was finally in total control of the atmospheric pressure, right? I could make everything better. I could be the flawless, omnipotent caregiver because, and this is the beautifully, hilariously tragic part, the recipients of my care had no real needs beyond what I projected onto them, right? The dolls never cried real tears. We couldn't afford those dolls. They never had complex existential crises. They never had these needs that I just couldn't anticipate, right? And they never required more energy than I had to give. They were just like this perfect passive patience for this tiny empath who was already developing a lifetime habit of trying to heal what she couldn't fix. I didn't know I was being recruited into this lifelong unpaid position. Okay, none of us do. The assignment always comes, like I said, just kind of covered in praise and delivered with a smile and disguised as some sort of a gift or something. It starts so innocently, but somewhere in those early exchanges, the trap snaps shut. Helping stops being something you do and it becomes who you are. But here's where my story, I guess, gets a little complicated. This is where the beautiful, neat narrative of natural born caregiver starts to completely fall apart. Because the exact same girl who tenderly rocked plastic babies to sleep at the age of 5 became an absolute unmitigated nightmare of a rebel as she grew older. Hi, it's me. The child who supposedly dreamed of healing the world grew up and decided she wanted to reject every single ounce of responsibility in her actual real life. By the time I hit middle school, the little mother had apparently left the building. Okay, I was skipping homework. I was talking back to teachers with a level of sarcasm that was honestly impressive. By high school, I'd upgraded my resume to include sneaking out of windows and lying through my teeth about whose house I was going to. Hey, if you've listened to season 3, you know all kinds of stuff about me. And I was also aggressively pushing every single boundary my parents tried to erect. I was completely irresponsible with my household chores. If you asked me to clean my room, you'd think I'd been asked to shovel coal in a 19th century factory. Okay? I was unreliable with my commitments. I was defiantly breaking rules. I was generally wearing the crown of the family problem child. Okay? This girl who had once been cooed over by aunts and grandmothers for her incredible maturity has now become the teenager who couldn't be trusted to feed the cat. Without a 3-part structural argument, probably. So how do we reconcile these two completely different versions of the exact same person? How does the little girl who wants to spend her entire life nursing babies in a hospital ward turn into a teenager who acts like clearing her own dinner plate is a violation of her basic human rights? For a long time, society looked at a pattern like mine and probably read it as hypocrisy, right? They read it as inconsistency or immaturity or manipulative teenage angst. I don't know. But I don't think the answer lies in bad behavior. It lies in understanding the massive, cavernous psychological gulf between chosen care and imposed responsibility, right? This contradiction, it's not unique to me. It lives in daughters absolutely everywhere. We see it all the time. If we actually bother to look past the surface frustration, right? We see it in the teenage girl who would stay up until 3 a.m. counseling her best friend through a devastating existential heartbreak. but will completely lose her schmidt if her mom asks her to fold her own laundry, right? We see it in the young woman who can single-handedly manage a massive family medical emergency, coordinating doctors and keeping everyone calm, but whose own personal finances look like a damn crime scene. What looks like a behavioral problem is actually a daughter's unconscious, desperate attempt to maintain some shred of personal autonomy in a world that's already kind of quietly assigned her everyone else's emotional well-being as her primary job. Okay? So think about this from the teenager's perspective. When your entire identity is being built around how useful you are to other people, and when you're constantly praised for being the stable one, the mature one, the one who doesn't cause problems, rebellion becomes the only available tool to prove you actually exist outside of your utility. Make sense? Like every missed curfew wasn't just me being a brat. It was a loud and clunky declaration that said, I'm not just here to meet your damn expectations. And every skipped assignment and every slammed door and every eye roll was like a crude, unarticulated boundary. Okay, it was my heart's subconscious way of trying to balance the scales and desperately trying to claw out of a little, just claw out this little bit of messy space for myself in a family system that had taught me my only value was cleaning up everyone else's mess. So the rebellious teenager and the nurturing child weren't contradictions at all. They were just two sides of the same coin, right? One side absorbed the world's pain and the other side threw a brick through the window just to make sure she still had a pulse. Right? There's a family therapist who specializes in gender dynamics, and she coined a term for this that I want you to tattoo on your brain. She calls it the good girl economy. Okay, so the good girl economy is essentially a high-stakes emotional trading system where young daughters are conditioned to trade their personal autonomy for adult approval. They learn to trade their individual, messy, inconvenient human needs for family harmony. And she explains it like this. Girls quickly learn very early in life that compliance and caregiving bring immediate, positive, warm attention. Meanwhile, asserting their own needs or expressing anger or throwing tantrums often brings immediate conflict, coldness, or dismissal. And in that environment, teenage rebellion isn't just a phase. It becomes one of the only survival mechanisms a girl has left to reclaim her own agency. But here's the really dark humor of the situation. Even when I was deep in my rebellion era, the caretaking training didn't actually stop. The programming was running so deep in my system that it was operating entirely outside of official family channels. I might have been completely irresponsible about my history homework, but guess who was still the unpaid full-time therapist for every single friend in my peer group? Me. I was still reading every room I walked into, like a seasoned meteorologist looking for a hurricane, right? I was still translating everyone's hidden emotions and playing peacemaker during cafeteria drama and trying to fix every broken heart within a 5-mile radius. I was lying to my parents about where I was going on a Friday night, sure, but I was still fiercely, hyper-responsibly managing the emotional needs of everyone in the car with me. The caregiver hadn't left. She'd just kind of gone underground. And while we're underground, running ourselves ragged, trying to keep the emotional peace, we watch the boys in the broader culture, and often the men in our own extended family trees, grow up in an entirely parallel universe where a completely different set of physics applies in the average family dynamic. So let's look at the double standard with a little bit of that dry clarity that we need to survive this topic, okay? In the average family dynamic, boys are explicitly praised for what they achieve, what they conquer, and what they build. They are encouraged to pursue their individual interests, aggressively defend their personal boundaries, and ruthlessly prioritize their own goals. When a boy contributes to a basic household task, it's heralded as a magnificent act of charity. It's called helping. Adults gasp and say, "Oh, look how helpful he is. He took out the trash." But when a daughter does the exact same work, it's not a charity project. It's baseline responsibility, right? It's the bare minimum expectation of her gender. And when a teenage boy babysits his younger siblings for an hour, he's doing his parents a historic, monumental favor that probably deserves some sort of financial reward and a medal. But when a teenage girl does it, she is simply fulfilling her natural default role as an auxiliary mother. We see this exact division of labor play out in a story from one who wants me to call her Maya. Her childhood household perfectly mirrors this kind of silent gender division, okay? Maya was the eldest of 4 children. Her mom worked part-time and her dad worked grueling long hours, and the baseline state of their household was absolute chaotic survival mode. By the time Maya was 8, she says she didn't just help out around the house, she was effectively hired as an unsalaried COO of the domestic sphere. Okay? If her mom was running late, Maya automatically stepped in to make the school lunches, and she helped her younger siblings with their math homework while her parents were occupied with a crying baby. She memorized permission slip deadlines. She mediated siblings' screaming matches and took it upon herself to make sure everyone had clean socks before the school bus arrived. And her parents, who were genuinely exhausted and doing the damn best they could, rewarded her with the ultimate currency of the good girl economy. They told her constantly how incredibly mature she was. They bragged to the neighbors about how they could always count on Maya. Maya told me, "I loved being needed back then. I genuinely thought it was my superpower. I was the magic fixer, the one who could calm the chaos, the one who kept the engine running. What I didn't realize until I was sitting in a therapist's office 30 years later was that while I was busy being the family superhero, I was quietly handing over my entire childhood." Now let's look at Maya's brother, who was only 2 years younger than her, living under the exact same roof, eating the exact same cereal. Her brother played sports, and he hung out with his friends, and he focused entirely on his own hobbies, his own schoolwork, and his own preferences. And when he was asked to help with a household chore, he would either conveniently forget, or he would do it so spectacularly poorly that someone else would inevitably get frustrated and take over. And more often than not, that someone else was, of course, Maya. Maya says, "Nobody expected less of him as a human being, but somehow everyone else automatically expected infinitely more of me, and I delivered, because that's what good daughters do." By the time she reached high school, Maya wasn't just a daughter. She was essentially co-parenting her younger siblings. She was driving them to soccer practice, helping them navigate middle school social crises, and providing these deep emotional supports to her parents whenever they struggled under the weight of life. Her family saw her as an incredibly capable, fiercely independent young woman. They looked at her and saw a success story. What they completely failed to see was that she was quietly drowning. She told me, "I never learned how to ask for help because my entire value was built on being the one who provided it. I didn't learn that my own needs mattered. I only learned that meeting everyone else's needs was the price of admission to be loved." When we look back at stories like Maya's, or when I look back at my own bedroom nursery empire, the truth becomes painfully clear. The dolls weren't just innocent childhood play. They were a rigorous training ground for a lifetime of trying to nurture what can never be healed. They taught us a highly dangerous, seductive myth, that excellent caregivers don't actually have needs of their own. Think about the psychology of a doll. It takes absolutely everything you have to give, your attention, your affection, your labor, your time, and it asks for nothing in return except the twisted satisfaction of being completely indispensable. The doll never stops to ask you how your day was. The doll never wonders if your back hurts from rocking it. The doll never challenges you to consider whether you're giving from a place of genuine abundance or whether you're completely scraping the bottom of an empty barrel. This is like the truly insidious, brilliant nature of the unspoken assignment, right? It doesn't just ask you to do extra dishes or manage a few calendar schedules, right? It colonizes your entire identity. You cease to be a human being who happens to help out. You become the helper. You stop being a person who navigates a crisis. You become the crisis manager. And for millions of daughters, this programming runs beautifully and silently in the background for decades until the moment of stark, terrifying recognition arrives. This moment usually hits during a major life transition. It happens when parents get divorced or when grandparents get sick or when this big family emergency kind of cracks the surface wide open. Suddenly, the invisible daughter looks around and realizes she isn't just being helpful. She's been officially, automatically designated as the family's structural support beam without ever signing a contract. So I'm going to share a story from a woman named Laura. She hit this exact wall when she was 34. Lauren's parents went through an incredibly messy, high-drama divorce when she was 22 and finishing up her senior year of college. She was living 3 hours away and drowning in her own exams and trying to figure out her future career. But back home, the family system automatically routed the chaos directly to her phone. Her mom would call her at midnight weeping about her father's behavior, and her father would call her an hour later asking her to manipulate her mother into signing some legal paperwork. And her younger brother was struggling with the fallout, so Lauren found herself driving 3 hours back and forth every single weekend, acting as an unpaid mediator and an emotional translator and a human shield for everyone's unmanaged rage, right? She told me, I remember sitting on the floor of my dorm room one Tuesday night, completely physically and emotionally bankrupt, staring at my phone ringing for the 5th time that day. And this thought finally broke through the fog. When did I become responsible for my parents' marriage? When did managing their adult emotions become my full-time job? That moment of recognition is incredibly painful because it never arrives alone. It always brings a deeply uncomfortable cocktail of emotions with it, right? You feel an intense, raging anger at the profound unfairness of the burden. But then, because you're a meticulously trained good girl, you immediately feel a wave of crushing guilt for daring to feel angry in the first place. You feel confused about how to even begin changing the dynamic without causing this massive explosion. And worst of all, you feel a strange, haunting sense of loss. Because you have to ask yourself the ultimate question. If I am not the family fixer, then who am I? If I drop the clipboard, does anyone even see me standing here? This is the great empath's dilemma that follows so many of us straight into our adult lives. How do you honor your natural, beautiful gift for feeling deeply without constantly drowning in the emotional overflow of everyone around you? How do you show love without completely disappearing into the background? How do you use your empathy as a genuine superpower instead of letting it become the very kryptonite that destroys your mental health? The 5-year-old girl who sat on my bedroom floor rocking those plastic dolls had beautiful, holy instincts. Caring is a stunning human capacity, and healing is necessary work, and nurturing is what keeps the world from spinning into cold chaos. But that little girl desperately needed an adult to sit down on the floor next to her and take her tiny hand and teach her that empaths need fierce boundaries. She needed to be taught that caregivers require deep care themselves. She needed to hear that even the most generous, loving hearts require protective armor. Instead, the only lesson available was that love requires total absorption. That caring means carrying the weight until your bones crack. That being good means being an open, boundaryless vessel for everyone else's unmanaged psychological garbage. If you're listening to this today and you recognize yourself in my room full of dolls or in Maya's endless chores or Lauren's midnight phone calls, I want you to know that the first step in breaking free from this unspoken assignment is simply having the courage to look it directly in the eye and recognize that it exists. Okay? The praise that trained us, the corporate conditioning that shaped us, the identity that has defined us for decades, none of it was a law of nature. It was all meticulously constructed. And because it was constructed, that means it can be deconstructed. Breaking free doesn't mean you stop loving your family. It doesn't mean you pack your bags and change your name and never speak to them again. Although, let's be honest, some Tuesdays that sounds highly therapeutic. It simply means that you stop giving your life away automatically. It means learning to distinguish between healthy, conscious generosity and automatic self-destructive sacrifice, right? It means finally realizing that your worth on this earth exists completely independent of how useful you are to other people. The assignment may have been unspoken, but your response to it does not have to be, and it's not too late. Thank you so much for listening to my first episode. If you'd like to connect and discuss, there's a Facebook group. If you'd like to support me in my work or just reach out to me, all the info's in the show notes. And I will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.